IVM.
In recent decades, hardworking and irreverent researchers, teachers and writers, women and men, have revealed that making diverse women visible exposes the actual workings of international politics. Women as Chinese businessmen's mistresses, women sewing clothes for Tommy Hilfiger and washing pesticides off Chiquita's bananas, women married to CIA operatives, women working in discos around military bases, women auditioning for the Miss World contest, women scrubbing floor in Saudi Arabia, and women lobbying delegates in the corridors of the UN. They observe, they cope, they calculate, they strategize, and sometimes they organize. Here is what I've learned from taking these women seriously. If we pay sustained attention to each and all of these unheadlined women, we will become smarter about this world. Smarter than a lot of mainstream experts. Smarter. I've thought a lot about what it means to become smarter. I don't think it means simply to become more clever, more facile, more hip. It sometimes means to become more cautious. It certainly means to become more nuanced in one's explanations. And nuance does not mean vague. It means capable of describing with clarity the multiple relationships at work and their consequences. To become smarter in the feminist sense of smarter, one, therefore, has to constantly stretch one's gender curiosity. Asking where are the women won't necessarily reap instant or superficial rewards. In fact, one might feel as though one is risking one's status as a serious person when asking where the women are and why they are there, who is benefiting from them being there, and what they think about being there. One's mentor, editor, or boss may make it clear that he or she considers spending one's time pursuing these gender questions a waste. Becoming smarter in this feminist sense will not make us more comfortable. We are likely to start wondering about our own complicity in the makings of this world's dysfunctions, its inequalities, its abuses and injustices. For we are not simply readers and questioners standing above or outside what we are exploring. We are living in this world. Even if we don't think of ourselves as members of an elite, although if we are able to read this page, we are indeed among the world's privileged, our ideas and actions are helping shape this world. We have our own relationships to all the women whose lives we are trying to understand. This should stoke the fires of our feminist curiosity, but it should also make us uneasy. In making women visible, I've discovered, one turns a bright light on men as men. It has been feminist-informed investigations of international politics that have yielded the most valuable insights into complex politics of masculinities, that is plural, but the meanings assigned to different ways for a boy or a man to demonstrate his manliness are not merely multiple, they usually are unequal and often rivals to each other. Disparaging certain kinds of feminities is common fodder in these rankings and contests. This is a key motivation for anyone exploring international politics of masculinities to adopt an explicitly feminist curiosity. All the men and women who have tried to make us genuinely smarter about international politics have revealed that what is international is far broader than mainstream experts assume, and that what is political reaches well beyond the public square. Sometimes taking these two new understandings on board has made my head spin, but it has also energized me. Redrawing the map of international politics has made the investigation into and the conversations about these politics a lot more lively. For me, that has been one of the genuine joys of being part of this collaborative, transnational, feminist, exploratory journey. Many more people, certainly a lot more women, are now in the conversation. They are adding their stories, their experiences, puzzles, and findings to that conversation. The windows and doors have been thrown wide open. Well, they should be. Hi, you're listening to States of Anarchy, a podcast on global affairs and foreign policy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. What you just heard is an excerpt from the preface of a book called Bananas, Beaches and Bases, Making Feminist Sense of International Politics by Cynthia Enloe. The book changes the way you look at the world and the roles that we play in it, and I highly recommend you read it. International relations is considered the last bastion for gender issues. When I started out in the field, I was often advised, Don't be a woman working on women in international relations. But how could I separate the political from the personal? How could my identity as a woman not affect the way I look at the world? How should we even look at gender in international relations? What questions should we ask? What lenses can we use? My guest for today is Dr. Swarna Rajagopalan. Swarna is a political scientist, writer, consultant, and social entrepreneur. She is the founder and director of Pragnya, the Pragnya Trust, a non-profit organization based in Chennai, which undertakes research, public education, and networking on issues related to peace, justice, and security. Swarna has worked extensively on issues related to gender, and on today's podcast, we're going to discuss how some of these dynamics play out in international politics and in India. But before we go to the conversation, let's take a short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. You know, the greatest place on earth to work on. If you're interested in working with us, please do send us your resume, careers@indusvox.com. We're looking for people in business roles. We're looking for people in creative roles. We're looking for audio engineers, graphic designers, all kinds of things. So please do apply. Also wanted to ask everybody, please tell a friend about your favorite podcast on the IVM network. We really do depend on your word of mouth. You are our biggest ambassadors, and we'd really, really appreciate all of your support. Also, if you are enjoying what you listen to, take a screenshot, tag us on social media, and we will repost that. On The Scene and the Unseen, Amit Verma is joined by journalist Namita Bhandare to talk about the job crisis for women in India. On the final episode of the Ronnie Screwwala podcast, we do a Q&A where Ronnie answers questions sent in from listeners as well as other podcast hosts from the IVM network. On Marbles Lost and Found, Avanti and Zen talk to therapist Ishita Pateria about eating disorders and how to deal with them. On the Edges and Sledges cricket podcast, Ashwin and DJ are discussing the women's and men's Ashes, the slate of cricketers retiring, India's performance versus the West Indies, Dhoni's contribution to the Indian Army, and a lot more. Last week, we released the season finale of the first season of Equity Sahi Hai. Tune into the show to listen to fascinating and insightful conversations about equity and various sectors in India you could invest in. The last two episodes feature special guest Ramdev Agarwal, co-founder of the Motilal Oswal Group. Check those out to learn more about his inspirational journey. This show was brought to you by the Motilal Oswal Asset Management Company. On IVM Likes, IVM staffers Abbas Saishri and debutant Antariksh sit down to discuss their go-to pop culture during the monsoon. On our Kannada podcast Thale Harate, Professor Zabiullah and Shant Kumar Patil talk to Pavan and Surya about the Dakni language and its history. On 9XM Soundcast, host Eva Bhatt is joined by an Indian-Canadian singer, Jonita Gandhi. She started her music career by singing covers on YouTube, and they discuss her journey from Canada to Mumbai, people who supported her, and how one should deal with trolls and negative comments on social media. On Paperback, hosts Satyajit Roy and Rachita Sharma are joined by the writer and creative editor, Himali Kothari. She discusses the process of meticulously writing and rewriting a story. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Hi Swarna, welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So in any conflict, women and children are the most adversely affected. But it's not something that we look at a lot in international relations. How would you place women in this canon?
In the tradition, in the canon of international relations till about the 1970s, women were actually invisible. This is the discipline, the academic discipline of international relations, which actually began with the writing of diplomatic histories. Women were invisible, although they were, if you look at contemporary diplomatic histories that are documenting the work of women through the ages, they were active, they were doing diplomatic work, but they were completely invisible in the canon that one would have studied in a post-war international relations program. In a sense, people were completely invisible. We had these airtight state units that somehow mystically interacted with each other. And that was what we based all of our understandings and assumptions on.
The idea that states are black boxes.
The states are black boxes, rational actors, realists, etc., etc. So the introduction of women into that agenda, I would say, dates back to the late 80s, really. Although, again, we have to bear in mind that for some of us, when you say international relations, there is the academic discipline, and then there is the world of international relations. And in the world of international relations, it's not that women were absent. They had not been absent in the diplomatic work about which histories were written that effaced their work. And they were not absent in the international relations of the League, of the formation of the United Nations, of the United Nations years in the post-war period. women and their activism, their transnational activism, was definitely part of the narrative of changing United Nations discourse, and through that, changing global discourse and development of norms around development, around rights, and so on. So it's just what we have been choosing to see over the decades. And in the last 30 years, we've seen the introduction of women first into those narratives, initially appearing as victims of international relations events, and then emerging as possible solution seekers. Now we've learned over the years to see their agency and to map it. And we're also learning to map their various standpoints as we go. So there has been a change. I think from about 20, 30 years ago till today, one difference in the male stream of the discipline would really be that people can't say that gender doesn't matter at all. They might secretly scoff at it, but in a public forum, it would be very uncool of them to say, this is irrelevant material. This is not part of the, this is not just grist to the mill at all.
Yeah, that's true. You can see the outrage over manels, right? These all-male panels where men are discussing what happens to, whether it's women as victims or whatever it is. But the idea that they're discussing these predominantly gendered topics without any diverse viewpoints.
Or even the fact that on social platforms that have no pretense to being radical or progressive per se, photographs of all male delegations negotiating peace, whether it's in Syria or in Afghanistan, go viral immediately. Someone puts a question mark on them and retweets them, and everyone is sharing them because there is something patently outrageous about the exclusion of half of humanity. Actually, more than half. Because what's visible to us is the exclusion of women, but we're not seeing other gender minorities. We're not seeing other kinds of minorities. We're just not seeing.
That's true. I mean, I think there was this photo project a couple of months back that took a lot of these multilateral forums and things like that, and then took out all the men from it, whether it was the G20 or just the UN, the World Bank. So you have all these photos and these are sort of empty rooms, basically. When you take the men out, there'll be like 5 women. 6 women. But
there's also that conference where they felt so embarrassed about having only men, they photoshopped 2 women in. I don't remember where that was.
I haven't seen that, but that sounds something like someone from international relations would do.
So clearly we've at least generated enough peer pressure for people to feel a little bit guilty.
Okay, here's a question. Why do we need more women? This seems like a very basic question at heart, but why do you need more women in decision making? Why do you need more women on panels? Because a lot of people argue that with the thing that let's go by merit. Let's not say we will have these many women and these many men. Let's say who is the best person for the job and we will just get them.
So let's take that question in pieces, okay? Because why do you need more women? Let's start with the simplest thing, conference panels. Why do you need more women in academic conversations about anything? Because women represent a particular variety of, not even an identical category, of a particular spectrum, a particular variety of human experience that in discussions in the humanities and social sciences must be included for that larger understanding to make any sense. If I give you half a banana and say it's the full banana, I'm trying to find a sensible comparison point, but the fact is that the exclusion of human beings is not sensible at all. So it just makes sense to say, we're going to be discussing a problem, but we're not going to be listening to a whole range of experiences that are relevant to it.
Particularly stakeholder experiences. These are not outside experiences.
Well, everybody at some level is a stakeholder in any human situation.
Yeah.
Right? So you are not going to listen, you're not going to take into account, you're not going to give voice, you're not going to frame a consensus kind of position or something we can all agree upon. then it's really kind of a hollow solution to anything. So that's the argument for and academic spaces are the safest places to experiment. If you have, I'm not even going to deal with the question of merit, and because I mean that's clearly a specious argument for any kind of inclusion, against any kind of inclusion. If you're really worried that non-meritorious humans will clutter your thinking, an academic space is about the safest place you can include them. Because let's face it, you don't really matter that much. Why should they be in the political process? Because it matters a whole lot. I mean, these are decisions we're making for all of us. And if women are not part of those decisions, let's talk about Afghanistan now.
Okay.
Because right now, top of my mind, top of many of our minds, is the peace process that is being attempted there.
Yes.
The so-called peace process, the talks with the Taliban, whatever you want to name it.
And also going back to just the root of the problem where, the US was sort of saying, women face a terrible time in Afghanistan. Women's rights is such a big problem in Afghanistan.
Given that women's rights were part of the 2001 rhetoric for entering Afghanistan, there is no argument for their exclusion from this round of talks with the Taliban. I mean, right there, one. Afghanistan and the US both have national action plans for implementing UN Security Council 1325, which means they're mandated to include women in peace processes. So, reason two. Also, the women of Afghanistan have done an incredible job through the Taliban years and thereafter, looking out for their own interests, protecting each other, creating shelters, advocating for their rights, doing peace work. One of the projects I'm really proud to have been a part of was to edit a collection of life stories collected in Dari and Pashto by an Afghan organization. And then I got to edit the translations and weave them into a storybook of peace stories.
That sounds lovely.
Amazing women. I mean, they didn't get to study. They stopped at 6th standard. They created sewing circles. And the sewing circles became reading circles. Then they did Quran studies because, then they used the Quran studies to approach religious leaders to talk about peace from within the discourse of Islam. Doctors who would treat militants and their families and then, just gently talk them into surrendering and joining the peace process. This kind of on-the-ground peace work that women have done at great peril. There's one woman in that book that talks about having lost her husband and, one child and being injured. I will not stop this work. The courage that women have brought to this work that they have done over the last 20, 30 years, why should that not be represented at the table? Why shouldn't those voices be heard? What is the sane, what is the humane, what is the ethical argument against their inclusion? I mean, why should I make an argument for their inclusion? Let someone make an argument to me for their exclusion. That's
a very powerful statement. First, please tell us the name of your book so that I can link it
It's actually online. It's by an organization called Women Peace Support Organization, Afghanistan. It's on their website, and I'll send you the link.
Awesome. We'll attach that in the bio of the episode. Now, here's a question when I think about women in decision making. Do women make decisions differently when compared to men? When you think of positions of power, like prime ministership, for example, then there's the idea that gender is not a variable for decision making. On the other hand, women do have different approaches to solutions. So how do you deal with that?
I don't think we can generalize. When you're talking about somebody who's a prime minister or a president, I don't think that's generalizable. I think it depends on the individual and that moment in history and what their reading of their choices are then. But if you take something like, say, Sushma Swaraj's role in the last few years, she was Minister for External Affairs, history will tell us what her actual scope for action or activity was. But all of us saw what she made of her position and what she made of the platform she had available to possibly become the most accessible MEA that I remember, This is something that she brought her temperament, her desire to serve in a particular way. Now, you can say this is not what the MEA is supposed to do, but what the MEA is supposed to do will change from decade to decade. It will change with technology. It will change with the needs of her constituency, which in this case had expanded to include Pravasi Indians. Mm-hmm. So who is to say what is the proper way to do this? But this was her individual genius, that she took the space she had and turned it into something quite creative. We can't really be certain what an individual woman would do. We can't say across the board that every prime minister who is a woman will do this or do that, because I think history tells us that women make realist decisions, women make hawkish decisions. Also, I don't think we can essentialize women's attitudes in politics. What we can say is that wherever you lie on a spectrum, now you don't have to come into politics as a pacifist woman, but you have to come into politics. We want to see women across the political spectrum, across the ideological spectrum. We want to see other gender minorities across the ideological spectrum.
That's true. I mean, because something that you often hear is that women are more amenable to cooperation, more pacifist. And I don't think that's true necessarily. I think you can have women from, as you said, all over the spectrum. And a lot of them, I don't know.
I think women are raised to adjust, to cooperate, to put themselves second, to seek consensus, to not confront. And these are traits that we nurture in female children. These are desirable behaviors in them. But I don't think there is a naturalness to that. There are I'm sure there are men who are instinctively cooperators and women who are instinctively assertive. I don't think essentialism works.
Yeah, and another approach I think would also, when you just look at sort of gender in international relations, would also look at intersectionality, right? The good thing about intersectionality is it gives you new lenses to look at problems in international relations, I think. For example, Dalit feminism or feminism that puts caste at the forefront could say that, one of the ways that they look at international relations is to say that, you look at national security as also consider violence against caste would be an essential part of their lens. So how do you deal with intersectionality, particularly in a field like international relations?
I think security studies has moved a little bit further down that road because while traditional security studies mirrored traditional international relations a great deal, again, in the last 20, 30 years, we've played with the field so much, we've challenged assumptions so much, that in new critical areas, specifically now, again, a new mainstream here is human security, we are looking intersectionally. We are looking at different kinds of security where there's plenty of room to look at conflict as being interstate, intercommunity, state versus community, state versus civil society, caste conflict. So, in fact, when we do advocacy around women in peace, one of the ways in which we address the challenge of making it relevant in places like Chennai, which is supposedly at peace, is to also look at structural conflict. The conflicts and the violence and the insecurity that arise out of intersectional disadvantages.
Yeah, I think that's...
And inequalities.
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting point, because when you look at human security intersectionally, then you will also be able to look at problems that don't come under traditional notions of security.
I mean, it's the whole point of human security is that security, I mean, the broad initial definition that people were using was freedom from fear and freedom from want. Freedom from fear and freedom from want are everything. It is freedom from fear that you won't have any water after July, and fear that somebody will come and get you because you use the wrong well.
Yeah.
It's the spectrum of human fear. It is everything that makes a human life vulnerable, puts a human being at risk.
Would you say one of the objectives of gender in international relations would be to analyze where your spectrum of fear arises?
It could be, if that's your question on a particular topic.
Okay.
But I think that gender is a framework or a lens rather than an actual topic. I mean, it's the way you approach things. And over the years, and I think I said this to you earlier when we were chatting, that, I don't come into this with 17 courses in gender theory or feminist theory. Feminism for me was a lived experience. It was a politics that I inherited and learned within my family and with my family as they went out to do activist work. So I bring that politics into my international relations and security training. And so going back and looking at some of the more complex jargon around gender, I think to me it means something very simple. And I like to say that here because I think sometimes when people first encounter technical literature, they get completely turned off and they miss the actual point, which is simply to make a commitment to consider all points of view, to see everything. When I pick up a problem, whatever the problem is, how many podcasts feature gender topics? Or how many international relations podcasts are there in India? I make a commitment to ask how many women run them, how many women produce them, how many are in studios that are owned by women, how many of them ask questions around gender issues. Is this just women or is this other gender minorities? I make that commitment. It's the commitment to see, the commitment to ask, the commitment to not make assumptions about who knows what above everything else. So it does not matter what the topic is. It's your commitment to how you look at it, what you bring to it. Is it a commitment to being inclusive, to listening, to thinking intersectionally? Or is it to add women and stir?
Yeah, which brings me to the idea of tokenism, right? When particularly in international relations, you will have panels, but you'll have one woman who's sort of on stage. Now, there are two ways to look at it. A lot of colleagues of mine used to say, tokenism is fine because at least there's a woman on the stage. But the way I look at it is, I don't want to be on the stage because I'm a woman. I want to be on stage because I do good work. How do you look at that?
It's a good question. At a certain point, a platform is a platform. I'm not talking about the early stage of your career where you're, a platform is a platform there too. But sometimes if I'm the only woman on a panel, I'm the only one who's going to say certain things. But the burden of always having to be the gender lens, of always having to speak for women, that's an unfair one. But if I don't do it, who will? So I still belong to a generation where I think there are few enough of us that we can't, I won't be that picky, but I will make a nasty comment now and say, oh, so you could only find one of me? Next time I'll give you 5 more. I might say that. But I think that's, but if you don't get a foot in the door, then who's going to listen to you complain? I mean, it's really, but it depends on the context. See, there are certain places where manners are completely unconscionable. If a university has a seminar and only the male students speak, then that's utterly unacceptable because clearly the enrollment is in the other direction. But then I think that, as you move, as it gets more rarefied, until women fill those ranks, it's harder, but it's not difficult to find women. And there are plenty of rosters of qualified women. And if you Google the numbers of women who do podcasts, who blog, who do op-eds, who tweet about certain topics, you can certainly find the same level of knowledge as you can among random men. So I think at bottom, it's genius. Choosing to be the one woman in a room is a personal decision based on your own calculation of cost benefit, value of the platform, who you want to meet in that room. But then I think not having more than one woman is sheer laziness.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it's a lot easier for me at the end of the day. International relations is a lot more inclusive now when I'm starting out than perhaps when you were starting out. How was it for you when you were beginning your
When I
career
started
in IR?
out, there weren't even there was only Jadavpur and JNU. There weren't any other IR programs I knew about in India. So I had to do my master's abroad. But now it looks like the field is just booming here and everybody's writing and everybody's publishing. Sometimes, it feels like we're the Rip Van Winkle generation. At one moment we were too young, and then all the Diggajs were male and over 70. And then in a flash we're too old because there are 20s and 30s everywhere and they're coming out of all of these schools that are burgeoning. So I think the field has changed quantitatively and qualitatively in the last 20 years.
Yeah, and something else that we were talking about earlier is that when you're starting out in international relations, and I got this advice a lot, they were like, okay, you're a woman who's working on security, don't look at gender. Don't be the woman who talks about women. Don't touch it with a barge pole. Just do other work. I don't know, would this be advice that you would give me or your younger self?
I don't know. I would not have had the choice. We began talking about women because we began noticing that we were absent. Very memorably for me, despite the feminist upbringing, we were at a 2-week security arms control and technology workshop in Pakistan. 10 Indians, 10 Pakistanis, 5 Chinese. And in the evening, the Indian and Pakistani women, some of us would hang out together and, talk about life and all the rest. The day was about something else. The evening conversations had completely different concerns. Even when we were talking about security, we were talking about different things. The disconnect between the conversations of the day and the conversations of the evening was so striking that in a sense got us thinking about security, got me thinking about security in different ways. I began to write about those conversations a lot more. And then a few years later at another workshop like that, for another 2-week thing, several of us who became friends there went on to do a book together, which was called Women's Security South Asia, which brought together the things that we thought were security problems.
Like,
for example, what is one of the first things you learn as a little girl? Come back home before it's dark.
Yeah, by the
Don't
sunset is curfew.
And take that route when you come from your friend's house. There are street lights there. Right there.
Yeah.
Right there. Have you ever come across this in a security studies class? No. Now you might, because enough of us have been pushing and saying gender-based violence is a form of insecurity. But in a situation where security was about war, peace, missile control, and so on, you didn't have this. You had no human beings. There were no human beings in this conversation. So we began to try and fill the picture, put human beings and human experiences. A friend of mine wrote about thalassemia being very common and what would be the larger social economic consequences of that. Somebody else wrote about how, Sudha Ramachandran wrote about how tigers leaders, women leaders, got to do a whole lot of things with decision-making. There was still a glass ceiling. So we looked at women in security, women and security, women and insecurity, the insecurity of women from a whole series of lived experiences. And that's really where the first challenges to the field began. So we began by thinking about women because nobody else was doing it. I would say to women now, if you don't talk about gender, if you are not gender sensitive, forget talk about gender, if you're not gender sensitive, if you don't speak for women, if you don't acknowledge gender inequality in your profession, who will? But on the other hand, Don't confine yourself to one area of expertise. And getting isolated, getting tucked into a corner will happen very easily because male colleagues will look at a project and say, oh, she's there. No, I never call her. Let's give her the gender chapter. So then you take the decision you take on that manner. You say, okay, I'll write this because if I don't, some man will or nobody will. I don't know which one is worse. Well, a gender-sensitive man might do a much better job than me.
That is true.
But it's also important for your own confidence to keep other expertise going, to also be able to speak in other conversations, to keep reading widely, to continue to teach broadly. But this is, again, a challenge in the field that we have not resolved. When I say then teach the mainstream courses, why aren't those courses integrating gender? When I say, supposing international trade flows are a mainstream IR topic, why isn't there a gender component there? So your challenge is twofold. It's to keep one foot in the mainstream and to keep one foot in the gender politics of your field. And it's a double burden. I mean, that is horrible. It's, that like the burdens never cease, the things we want women to do.
No, they don't. And I mean, I think it's very important to do this because particularly for younger women, because it would sort of be a disservice to women who came before them to not continue this commitment to gender, not open up more spaces that have been closed before, because that momentum is rolling. So if you don't build on it, then it sort of
And
goes
sometimes when older feminist professionals hear younger women talk with a sense of entitlement about how things are easy or how there's no gender discrimination, we don't know whether to be annoyed or to really despair, because if they are not aware of this, given everything that is available to them, all the sensitization that could be theirs, if they are not aware at 22 or 25, life is going to get very tough for them at 55.
That's true. And I think, but that's not a problem that's specifically IR.
No.
I see women everywhere going,
Yes.
but we're equal. If you want to be equal, then don't be so affected by these issues.
Yes, and absolutely.
And I don't know how to explain to them that I'm not, a personal victim, or I don't take these issues up, in a sense, in quotes, because I'm a crusader of sorts. Right?
You're absolutely right. I think across the board, it's very hard to talk about gender politics and gender inequality without seeming somehow like a spoiler or petulant or just, a victim of a victim by choice. But in fact, these are structures that are real and that are out there. And the advantage that people with academic training have is that we have learned to step a little bit outside the frame and point to the frame. I can also tell you, okay, but let me bite back how much you're irritating me. And if you will give me a minute, I will show you how this frame works. Let me tell you how patriarchy is a problem for everybody, whether or not you have experienced this particular discrimination or that particular disadvantage. This is a problem for all of us.
Yeah. The problem is also, I mean, I don't know if it's a problem, but because women's experiences are so diverse and you have different kinds of feminism, it's just sort of the way that those feminisms deal with each other. We're not able to find common ground.
But in my journey and in your journey, the fight between other feminisms doesn't matter. It's your thought process and your decision, your conscience, your own understanding that determines your path. It is not really important. You don't have to declare yourself this or that, but you have to be a certain way and you have to be committed to being that way in everything that you do. And that itself is hard.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you just sort of reduce all of these feminisms and all of this jargon to what you said earlier about just, a commitment to being more open, to ask questions about where people are, I think that itself would sort of give you a framework to just look at problems.
in the context of disasters, for example, it means looking at all victims of disaster. So just because I do gender doesn't mean I only look at women. Now we've already learnt about women who couldn't swim, women who got trapped in their saris, etc., etc. But what about all the men who were suddenly left to cope with families that they had never looked after? Who were doing housework, men who were traumatized by loss but had never learnt the emotional vocabulary to articulate. It's when you make a commitment to look at gender, whether in war or in disaster or in any ordinary situation, you look at everybody and their particular story,
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of gender. I mean, a lot of people think it's sort of ranting about how women are disadvantaged, but the way I look at gender is to say all of us are sort of suffering because of systemic structural inequalities. And what is the way out of it? How can we make all of our lives better? But I also don't want to then slip into this, what people say, I'm not a feminist, I'm a humanist. And that is a statement that really irks me, because for me, they're the same thing. So it's just, I don't know, ways.
Well, have you read that quotation by Dale Spender? She says women have not fought wars, etc., etc. They have fought for better labor conditions, better wages, maternity care, and so on and so forth. So if you're not a feminist, I want to know why. It's a paraphrase. She puts it better than that. But really, why aren't you a feminist? I want to know.
Exactly. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you're able to argue these things because you have an education which would have been denied to you, because you have rights that would have been denied to you. And yeah, it seems to me a very
Or you couldn't finish
question.
school because you kept fainting, because you weren't getting enough iron in your diet post-puberty. So you failed your SSC once, you failed it twice, and that sealed your fate for life.
Yeah, or you just weren't allowed to complete it because you had housework.
It's a snowballing journey of disadvantage. No?
Yeah.
I mean, if you think of all the things that might not have been in the life of any girl, it's much longer than what actually happens to her.
That is true. And I think...
but that's really awkwardly put, but...
No, but I completely agree. I think, all things equal, feminism has made all our lives better. If, I don't know, but that's how I feel every day. I'm very grateful.
I'd agree.
Coming back to sort of academia and sort of the structural problems with it, we know that there is a problem with sort of citing women. We know that women get cited lesser. We know that their work is less often in curriculum. Apart from just, there will be a gender component sometimes in most curriculum these days. 1 week or one class sometimes.
But if you don't read, it's okay. It won't come in the exam.
Exactly.
Or it'll come as optional question.
But how do you deal with that? How do you deal with sort of citing more women's work, with hiring more women? How do we make women present on the field?
We simply do the opposite. We start citing women. We start reading women. We start taking women seriously. I retweet anything that any of my women colleagues write, whether I agree with it or not. I routinely retweet, I routinely share, because I think if we don't amplify each other's scholarship, who's going to do it? Including making a point of seeking out and including a variety of voices when you assign reading is very important. Of course, hiring decisions. If for some ridiculous reason you actually can't find enough women candidates, make sure you get lots of guest lecturers, make women visible on campus, screen their films, do book club readings around their work. I don't think all these things sound like excuses to me. I don't even see what the impediments are, because now there is a critical mass of women scholars who are available to teach, to write, to be experts, to be on those shouting TV panels.
And there are rosters, there are lists that have been made with women who are more than qualified to speak on a lot of issues.
But the thing is also, the question of qualified only applies to women. I mean, okay, that's the subject of another podcast, perhaps.
That I completely agree. Here's my last question for you. if someone wants to look a little more at gender and international relations, what reading would you recommend? What resources would you recommend that they go through?
I would have anybody start with Cynthia Enloe's Bananas, Beaches and Races. It's a simple, accessible, erudite overview. It opens doors that you can then follow through yourself in the real world or through other reading. And it's delightfully written. So I would definitely say start with Cynthia Enloe. In the region, there's a library of women scholars in South Asia. The writings of people like Rubina Sehgal or Sabagul Khattak in Pakistan. In Bangladesh, Amna Mohsin or Meghna Koha Thakurta. In Nepal, people like Bandana Rana, where they have written usually for NGOs, but they're writing. In Sri Lanka, there are, I just could reel off numbers, Radhika Kumaraswamy, Malati Dialwis, the Women in Media Collective. There's fantastic feminist writing coming out of Sri Lanka. Sunila Kumari Jayawardena, who wrote the classic Feminism and Nationalism in the Third World. And in India, in Maldives, there's my friend Farah Didi, who's now ambassador in the UK. And there's in India, there's people from the older generation like Kamla Bhasin, who've written on partition, for example. They've not written on international relations itself. But then when you start reading feminist work, this is the thing. The inside-outside doors vanish. The domestic international blurs. The private-public blurs. So the introduction of a feminist politics and the gender lens actually starts blurring distinctions and complicating images and stories. So there's a whole host of people that you can read. There is, as opposed to 30 years ago, there is no shortage of literature. And you should just start where you are.
Start where you are, I think, is a great note for the end of this episode. Thank you so much, Swarna.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
So that brings us to the end of this episode of States of Anarchy. Gender is pervasive. You can't run away from it how much ever you try. So I suggest you read up instead. I've attached a bunch of resources for you in the episode description. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter @HamsiniH or on Instagram @States of Anarchy. If you haven't subscribed already, you should. Just go to the IVM podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts from and click on subscribe. We'll be back next Tuesday.
Hi listeners, we at Aditya Birla Sun Life Mutual Fund have come up with a special podcast series called MF 101 in collaboration with Bloomberg Quint. MF 101 is an informative series that will help you understand the recipe behind mutual fund investments. And what's more, it's coming from the chefs of the mutual fund buffet table, from the very own fund managers and analysts who are the manufacturers of the funds that help you realize your investment goals. New episodes out every Monday. You can listen to the show on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm DJ, one of the presenters of the Edges and Sledges cricket podcast. I'm based in London and host the podcast along with my friend from school, Varun, who's based in Singapore, and his brother Ashwin, who's based in the US. We've all been massive fans of Indian cricket all our lives, and despite living in 3 different time zones and having pretty busy professional lives, we decided to start our own cricket podcast in March 2018. After putting out 59 episodes on our own, we were delighted to join IVM in May 2019, becoming the first pre-existing podcast to be picked up by India's largest podcast network. We've chatted with some awesome people, had some fantastic cricketing conversations along the way. But the main reason we do this every week is to have fun discussing the same cricket topics and issues that you guys are talking about every day in your living rooms. We're fans, not experts, so expect us to be honest. We really hope you decide to join us every week on the podcast.